Hello. Today there will be another conversation concerning the problematics of state institutions and their interconnections. But first we'll start with the events of recent days. As you know, on May the 9th, the country once again celebrated Victory Day. This is really the biggest holiday that unites, if not the entire people, then the overwhelming majority of the country's population, those people who think about the meaning of life, the development of the country, but not only those for whom May the 9th is one of the days off, when they can go out into nature, grill kebabs, drink something strong. In the city of Yekaterinburg, a young man went to the immortal regiment with a banner of the slogan, "Our grandfather's blood was not shed for such a country." Naturally, it can't be said that this event caused a storm of emotions, but publications about this are entitled as follows. A Yekaterinburg resident from the immortal regiment caused half the country to quarrel over a controversial banner. Well, the comments on this post, I will only read negative opinions, they are different. What does the current situation in the country have to do with the memory of those who fought and shed blood? They fought with the invaders and fascists, with another country that wanted to destroy and enslave most of the population of our country. Sergei, that's how the youth made our country like that. There is no one to work in it. Nobody wants to. They just want to have everything ready. Vitaly, young people would be glad to work. But where? In shops? There is no production left in the country. Everything is being sold and sold. Vitaly, don't talk nonsense. Since when did the youth and people begin to do something with the country? And look, not a single elderly veteran cries on the shoulder. That's not the case with young people. Everything is said right, I completely agree. And the guy is right. Our grandfathers shed blood, gave their lives so that we could live happily, could breathe freely. And what is happening? Veterans live out their lives in poor barracks. We pay crazy mortgages. Pensioners rummage through garbage dumps to eat. This is darkness. And it's bitter to see that our ancestors gave their lives for this. The guy is right, painfully right, no matter how bitter it is. In general, there were statements of this kind saying that this whelp does not know life, he has not seen it, and that the grandfathers were not fighting for the power of the commies. You see, war is not a chess game. When the leaderships of two countries conclude an agreement, let's fight and see who is cooler. War, as Karl von Clausewitz rightly said, is the continuation of policy by other means. But Clausewitz's phrase also has an addition. The politics of peacetime is the continuation of war by other means. If we talk about what means, then in the materials of the conception of social safety, the hierarchy of generalized means of governance is presented, and this hierarchy of generalized weaponry is that which is now commonly called hybrid war. This is a very ancient phenomenon that existed in those days when such a term did not even exist. But the essence of the matter boils down to the fact that if there exist objective laws to which the lives of people are subordinate, and you are able to modify the culture of your adversary in such a way that these objective laws work for your interests, but not for the interests of the adversary, then this is also a hybrid war. If we talk about the Great Patriotic War, then the Great Patriotic War, both on our part and on the part of the Third Reich, was fought for the implementation of quite certain meanings and political objectives. Well then, the Overton window, how to reduce the meaning of the war to the nonsense of the fact that we simply won and now we have 100 varieties of sausages in our stores and all that stuff. And this, they say, is unbelievable happiness. We hear, every May the 9th, on the eve of it and after it, the song The Sacred War. And now ask yourselves a question. Do you know its full text? Ask those around about it, whether they remember the full text of the Sacred War. Well, then compare on the internet the full text and the text of what is performed, including Alexandrov's Song and Dance Ensemble, and you will find that the second verse is thrown out of the text of the Sacred War. The second verse is about the meaning of war. Like two different poles, opposed in everything we fight, we strive for happiness and peace, they for the kingdom of the night. And only after that comes the next verse with the words, "Black wings shall never dare fly o'er the motherland, on her spacious fields the enemy shan't dare to stand." To say that it just happened by itself, that it does not make any political sense, one must be an idiot. The perversion of the text of the sacred war is a political act aimed at idiotizing the population and consigning the historical past to oblivion. Because if we talk about that war, they fought not only to defeat Germany, they fought for something else. The fact is that in the Soviet Union, one could be dissatisfied with two things. One had to be dissatisfied with the fact that the state proclaims a policy and carries out a policy aimed at building socialism and communism, a society in which there is no place for the parasitism of any minorities on the labor and life of the majority. Moreover, there is no place for systemic parasitism. This is one reason for the dissatisfaction that could be in the Soviet Union. The parasites were dissatisfied with this policy. The second thing that one could be dissatisfied with was the fact that the building of socialism and communism is accompanied by mistakes and abuses. And as a result of these mistakes and abuses, the quality of life in the Soviet Union was lower than it could have been. Well, you yourselves understand that along with those who, in their personal development, rose to the level of political thinking, there were a number of people for whom, whatever kind of power there was, it didn't matter. Tsar, Führer, presidential republic, parliamentary republic, something else. The main thing was that the stores would have everything they wanted, and their income would enable them to buy it. How social governance was organized, good or bad, whether it could be better, whether our society was developing or degrading, this never interested them, and does not interest them, because all their interests come down to consumerism interests. Well, due to this kind of absence of ideas, one must understand that in the Great Patriotic War, after the catastrophe in the summer of 1941, those idiots who were dissatisfied with the building of socialism, and those idiots who were apolitical, in fact formed the social base of those from whom the Nazis, in the occupied territories, built their occupational power, their own governing bodies. Well, in general, with the exception of a relatively small number of people who collaborated with the occupation power due to instructions of the Soviet intelligence. But the bulk of those who cooperated with the Nazis were short-sighted bourgeois who wanted capitalism, and they were politically idealist common folk who just survived as they could, solving the task of having everything that the circumstances provided. And since the circumstances were controlled by the invaders, they had to cooperate with them. And in fact, this part of our society has nothing to do with victory, except that they either hindered or awaited who would surpass, in order to take their side when the winner was determined, and they didn't want to be mistaken. There were a lot of such people too. And now this theme of meanings, for which our fathers and grandfathers fought, the state propaganda officialdom is trying to bypass. The church got involved in this matter, since the church declared that it's not necessary to equate the victory with the role of Stalin. Here is the question for the church. If we are believers, and understand that the Almighty ultimately governs the global historical process, then we must admit as a fact that the Almighty personally entrusted the governance towards the country from 1923 to 1953 to Joseph Vissarionovich Jugashvili, who entered history under the pseudonym Stalin. And the preparation of the country for victory in the Great Patriotic War, leadership of the rear and the front during the war, the restoration of the national economy, and the creation of the country's defense potential in peacetime, in the post-war period, from the intrasocial level of governance in the USSR, one way or another, was under the power of Stalin. And therefore the statement of the Church on the theme that Stalin had nothing to do with the victory, to put it mildly, is blasphemous. He had something to do with the victory, and made a great contribution to ensuring that history happened exactly as it happened. But this again is a matter of the sophist, of those who feed on the cult led by the synod of the Russian Orthodox Church. And again, it is not harmful to recall that Stalin's ratings are growing, while the ratings of the Orthodox monarchy remain at about 3 to 5%. And this is not the mistake of the people. It is the result of the politics that were carried out after 1953, and have been carried out to the present. Our fathers and grandfathers fought not at all for the fact that the Central Bank of the Russian Federation would not be responsible before Russia, de facto and de jure, and for the Central Bank to pursue a policy of economic genocide. Our fathers and grandfathers did not fight for people to retire after 40 years of work and receive pitiful handouts that don't allow a person to live normally, while other citizens in the country own planes and yachts, villas in Russia and abroad, the cost of which in some cases exceeds the multi-year payroll fund of entire sectors. And in fact, the problematics of social previousness will have to be introduced into the agenda, into the broadcasting network of the mass media, and politics should be built so that new generations are aware of the fact that they are worthily continuing the cause of the victors in the Great Patriotic War. And now let's return to the question of statehood and the interrelationship between statehood and society. Statehood is a subculture of governance towards the affairs of social significance in localities within the entire society on a professional basis. Modern civilization, with the type of culture that has taken shape, cannot exist without state governance and statehood. This is an immediate rollback to the Stone Age, or a level close to that, not even of the slave-owning system, but of something very primitive. And accordingly, if we talk about the interrelationship of state-social relations, then society should, in some way, reproduce statehood in the continuity of generations, improving it. How? First of all, people who are aware of the interests of social development, ways of social development, and are able to realize them, should work in the state apparatus. And people who are professionally inconsistent, and people who see power as a means of satisfying their egoism, must in some way leave the state apparatus and find employment for themselves, or society must find employment for them in other spheres of activity, where they could not abuse power. There is a saying connected with this process: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This saying implies that such a mode of functioning of state power, when power works for the interests of an ordinary person, is in principle impossible. But people pronouncing this saying do not think that this saying is in essence blasphemous. Why? Because absolute power belongs to the Almighty. If absolute power corrupts absolutely, then you yourselves understand what conclusion stems from this. This conclusion is slanderous in relation to the Almighty and accordingly blasphemous. Therefore, in reality, power does not corrupt anyone, and gaining power and moving up the hierarchy of state power opens up possibilities for nravious vices to manifest themselves in real life, since while there is no power, and there is some responsibility, or fear of responsibility before others, before the law and state power, in this case, people behave more or less correctly. When they find themselves in bodies of state power, they begin to show their true essence, because those who were engaged in democratic reforms of the 1980s of perestroika, and in the early 90s, in general in the 1970s, they would have behaved differently, simply because they would have been afraid of the KGB and the OBKHSS. And when they found themselves in state power, and received the go-ahead to dismantle the Soviet Union, their true essence fully manifested itself. Well, in particular, let me remind you that Yegor Timurovich Gaidar, in those days, was a member of the editorial board of the magazine Communist, and when he became the acting prime minister, his politics were wholly and completely pro-bourgeois. Therefore, the question that citizens who find themselves in bodies of state power should be, first of all, decent people, is truly relevant. And if you catch a person in a lie, in egoism, in the fact that he succumbs to manipulation by some forces, including those behind the scenes, then you should be aware that he has nothing to do in bodies of state power except harm. And accordingly, electoral procedures should be used in such a way that such people do not end up in bodies of state power, or if they do end up there by strength of the fact that we don't have a column against all candidates on the ballot papers, and there are no juridical procedures that prescribe the necessary actions if the candidate against all candidates wins, then at least the political forces that won the elections should not delude themselves in relation to popular support. That is, if 10% of the population came to the elections and 80% voted for someone, then this someone should know that only 8% of the population support him, and 92% of the population have a completely different opinion about his activities, which the built-in Russia system does not allow to express and implement. But if it becomes chronic, then this system will collapse, as has happened many times in history. Therefore, the organization of state power should be such that ravishly depraved people disappear from it, both at the initiative of other bodies of state power and at the initiative of the population, which loses trust towards certain representatives of state power. And in addition, the system should accumulate the professionalism of governors, and accordingly, provisions such as limiting the term of office should be removed from the Constitution, for the simple reason that long-term projects require long-term governance. If a person is able to effectively carry out his functions in the interests of the development of the country within several terms, then there is no reason to limit the number of terms of his office in this or that position. Why? Because if he loses trust among the people, then, in a normal electoral system, he will not win the next elections. Of course, on condition that the electorate is competent. That is, the electorate is conscious of what is happening in the country, conscious of the tendencies, and is able to evaluate the tendencies and distinguish between useful and unuseful ones, and, accordingly, votes so that adherents of harmful tendencies do not end up in bodies of state power. And among other things, in order for the quality of personnel in bodies of state power to be the highest possible, it is necessary that the social base of the governorial corps be the whole of society, but not some elite groupings. To put it differently, any representative of society, any child born in any family, should have the opportunity to receive an education that allows him, if he has such a desire, if he has the trust of those around him, to enter bodies of state power and work effectively there. The problematics of interrelations between society and state power is really not the simplest problematics, but it is key to solving many problems of society and to preventing the emergence of problems in the future. It all comes down in general to a few principles that need to be implemented. The first, the social base, the sphere of governance, is the whole society, education that allows one to effectively govern, moreover, in both aspects, working in the state apparatus and taking part in electoral procedures. Well, if education allows, then the question of education comes down to the scientific methodological support of state governance. And in the state apparatus itself, ethics should work, which ensures the possibility of voluntary departure of professionally burnt-out governors, the forced removal of the incompetent and those who abuse power, and the involvement of people from society whose creative potential in the field of state governance is evaluated as positive, blago-carrying, allowing to solve certain problems of the country. What is happening in Russia, what happened in post-Soviet times, is just an alternative to what should be. And the alternative to what should be is largely a consequence of the inadequacy of scientific methodological support of state governance. Therefore, completing the theme of statehood, recalling the scheme of social institutions, we are smoothly flowing into the theme of the institution of science as a factor that should work out the adequate scientific methodological support for state governance. The era when state governance could be carried out in a number of cases, even by illiterate kings who could neither read nor write, but who acted on the basis of what they themselves and their subjects perceived as common sense, ended long ago. And in essence, the first attempts to provide society with scientific methodological support for state governance date back to the 15th century. The book by Machiavelli, The Prince, the correspondence between Ivan the Terrible and Kurbsky, many treatises in China, India, Japan, devoted to issues of politics and state governance. These are the first attempts to express what can be called scientific methodological support of state governance. In modern conditions it also exists, although the term scientific methodological support of state governance is not used. And the trouble is that if in a circle of acting politicians administrators, one says the words scientific methodological support of state governance, then for the overwhelming majority of them it is about nothing. That is, everything is bad. By default, in Western culture, the scientific methodological support of state governance includes two components. Some know-how, into which people are initiated as they move up the levels of state power, positions. And in the US, one of the problems is that Trump turned out to be at the top of public politics bypassing a whole slew of positions that other presidents of the United States usually held. That is, work in Congress, work as a governor, and Trump, immediately after business, became president. In other words, some questions that were brought to the attention of his predecessors, Trump, due to the peculiarities of his biography, passed over. The second component is what universities provide. Oxford, Stanford, Cambridge, and other elitarian universities, which are the forging workplace of governorial cadres for the states of Europe. An analysis of what the professors of these universities write on the theme of state governance shows that this is largely unreliable information, but which plausibly explains the ongoing possibilities, and thereby this plausibility hides real power, which is exercised on slightly different principles and by slightly different means under the cover of all this demagoguery. If we turn to the Soviet past, then in the Soviet past, the scientific methodological support of state governance was represented by Marxism-Leninism. But the Soviet historical past is also not homogeneous, because if you analyze the materials of the plenums and congresses of Stalin's era and the post-Stalin era, you will see a certain difference. In the Stalin era, the analysis of the situation in the country, in the world, the analysis of the prospects, it was correlated with the Marxist theory, which was far from being false in everything. And in the post-Stalinist times, everything became to the contrary. Fancies and declarations were based on certain quotations from the classics of Marxism-Leninism. Do you understand the difference? We analyze life. And this analysis we express in the lexicon of the theory based on the conceptual apparatus of this theory. This allows us to develop a uniform understanding of what should be done and how by many different people, both acting in bodies of state power and acting in other spheres of society. And the second variant, we have some fancies, and in order to promote these fancies into politics without losing our face, some quotations from the classics of Marxism-Leninism are tailored towards these fancies. Well, what if these fancies are not adequate to the objective possibilities of development? And a special question arises from where and how these fancies arose in the minds of those who offer them to the people as a policy. This is a completely different variant of governance. Therefore, the reason for the collapse of the USSR, if we touch upon the aspect of scientific methodological support of state governance, is the inadequacy of Marxism. And the second reason, the refusal to develop the scientific methodological support of state governance. Shortly before his death, Stalin spoke on the phone with Chesnakov and said that we need to develop a theory. We can get confused about something, but if we do not develop a theory, we are dead. And the questions of the development of the theory, this is what was rejected. And second, fancies began to be scientificized. Expressing fancies taken out of the context of the provisions of sociological theory of Marxism, other provisions were forgotten and rejected. In particular, in Marxism, the themes of bureaucracy and the need to de-bureaucratize state governance are developed not badly. Lenin saw the principles of de-bureaucratization. The main principle in the field of economy is the reduction of wages in state governance to the average in society. Well, there is such a subtle thing. Something is received as a salary, but something is received in the form of state support of the lives of those people who are engaged in this very state governance. In the form of state support in addition to salaries, there is special housing, special vehicles, security, and so on and so forth. It is really necessary, in the conditions that the life of society is, after all, a hybrid war. And it is no secret that Fidel Castro, who pursued a policy unwanted by his neighbors, successfully survived more than 100 attempts on his life. That is, measures of state support are really necessary in a hybrid war, in which the destruction of unbeneficial politicians in other states is a centuries-old practice of political activity, in fact of all Western states. In the aspect of Russia, Ivan the Terrible was helped to die. Pavel I too. Nikolai I, by all appearances, was also helped to die. Alexander III, too. Well, in general, the fact that the February coup was coordinated by the ambassadors of France and Great Britain, is also not a secret for anyone. Therefore, such measures are necessary. But nonetheless, debureaucratization does not imply such a gap in salaries between a rural laborer and a State Duma deputy, which occurs now in Russia, because with such a gap in salaries, in fact we have real corruption, legalized in the form of these very salaries of top officials of the state, which are many times higher than the average salaries in society, plus the cost of state support for each individual employed in state power, despite the fact that not all the state support is security measures. A big part of it is to ensure comfort and consumption of these persons on account of salaries. There was such an academician, Evgeny Samuilovich Varga, and he estimated that the level of state consumption, state support of the highest officials of the Soviet Union, corresponded to the standard of living of the millionaires of the United States. To put it another way, in the post-Stalinist times, the power in the USSR really became an attractive feeding trough. And at political seminars, the reproduction of fragments from State and Revolution, where Lenin wrote about the need to reduce salaries to an average level, this immediately caused the termination of the seminar, a break, and after the break, they moved on to consider some other themes without discussing these issues. This is one of the indicators that even if there is scientific methodological support, then its use is always selective, and one way or another, in order for scientific methodological support to be fully used, and used well, a certain social control is required, which includes two aspects: knowledge of this scientific methodological support, and some democratic procedures that allow citizens to remove from bodies of state power those who abuse power, including by means of inadequate application of scientific methodological support of state governance. And if we talk about the life of a sufficiently civilized society, then science as a social institution must solve the task of working out and improving this very state scientific methodological support of state governance. And this is just one of the many tasks that science as a social institution must solve. If we talk about the role of science in the life of modern society, the needs for the development of science, then science must ensure scientific technological progress. Not scientific technological progress in general, but scientific technological progress should be such that the stability of the biosphere is ensured in the regions of the planet and the planet as a whole. And a healthy lifestyle, in which medicine would play a different role than it does now, and there would be a different medicine, is ensured for people. If civilization leads a healthy lifestyle, then medicine is mainly about coping with some kind of emergencies of the organism that have arisen as the result of episodic, rare violations of what are the norms of a healthy lifestyle. But if medicine becomes as popular as the food store, and its remedy and surgery is the only way to ensure the existence of living generations and the reproduction of new generations, then this is one of the indicators of the collapse of science as a social institution. In the old days, Dmitry Anatolievich Medvedev, when he became president, proclaimed a course for the modernization of the country. After some time, he said in one of his speeches that they had failed in the modernization of the country. We have not heard a report on why they failed, and what needs to be done in order for the country's modernization to take place. We have heard it neither from Dmitry Anatolievich, nor from the head of the Ministry of Economic Development, nor from the Academy of Sciences, nor from any other authorities and institutions. Well, sometimes TV shows us something from Skolkovo. Yes, there are some achievements. However, here is a watch. The bracelet is Soviet. The case watch is of the first Moscow watch factory, Seiko mechanism. Here is a laptop, Sony Vaio. Inside there is a Microsoft product. Let me remind you, the time between the catastrophe of the summer of 1941 and the flight of Gagarin is less than 20 years if we don't count several months, and accordingly we have the right to expect that effective managers, in the course of more than 20 years in power, will ensure the quality of life, the quality of scientific technological progress will be higher than in Soviet times. Well, TV also showed us Horus. What there is Russian, what there is imported, This is a special question. But Horus is a singular achievement, maybe. And as a result of the fact that Horus appeared at the victory parade, Vaz Production, by the way, who is the owner of Vaz, UAZ Production, again, who is the owner of UAZ, did not become more attractive than Toyota Production, BMW, or something else. The ZIL company has not been resurrected, AZLK has not been resurrected, the Stalingrad tractor plant is still in ruins. A tragedy struck at Sheremetyevo Airport on May the 5th. A superjet perished. Unfortunately, this is not a tragedy that can be characterized as a single, accidental catastrophe. Something unexpected, sudden, unforeseeable, and unpredictable. This is really the embodiment of the collapse of scientific technological progress in post-Soviet Russia. That is, it is natural and expectable. One of the accusations against the planned economy was that there was no competition. Okay, let's see how it was in Soviet times. We entered the war with fighters MiG, Yak, LAGG-3. MiG left the scene, not due to the fact that it was a bad plane, but its tactical technical characteristics were not in demand by the frontline aviation. The Yak was modified throughout the war, with an eye on the LAGG. During the war, the LAGG was transformed into the LA-5, then the LA-7, and in general it turned out that in the conditions of a planned economy, all military aviation of Stalin's times was created on a competitive basis. Further, civil aviation. There was the IL-18, AN-10, Tu-104. The IL-18 won the competition. The AN-10 turned out to be unreliable due to the fact that the designer made a mistake in the choice of structural materials. The Tu-104 was in fact an experimental aircraft, which was not supposed to go into production due to many characteristic features. The IL-18 is still remembered as high in reliability and serviceability for its time, because you yourselves understand that today the IL-18 is hopelessly outdated, although its military modifications are still in use. And the perished in Syria IL-20 is one of the military modifications of the IL-18. And here is the superjet. Supposedly there should be some competition, but it has no alternative. And in order to produce the superjet, someone banned the production of the Tu-334, which was ready for mass production by the time the development of the superjet project began. And had the governance towards scientific technological progress been carried out sensibly, then both the Tu-334 and the Tu-204 could have gone into mass production. And while they flew, it would have been possible to make a superjet, some other competing models, conduct comparative tests, trial operation, and after that, to launch into mass production, to see what is better, thus preserving scientific design schools, production capacities of the domestic aviation industry. Well, in the end, in a market economy and a supposedly competitive environment, we got a superjet, which foreign airlines refused to buy, because it spends too much time on the ground waiting for spare parts and maintenance, and spends too little time in the air carrying out transportation. In other words, if we approach the analysis of what scientific technological progress is, then the governance towards scientific technological progress in Russia is totally inadequate, and is significantly worse than it was in Soviet times. Therefore, it is necessary to study the question of what scientific technological progress is as a socio-economic phenomenon. Well, in fact, it turns out that in order to describe it, the terminology that had developed in sociology by the end of the 20th century is clearly not enough. Why? If you correlate with written sources, then the idea of the helicopter was expressed by Leonardo Da Vinci, so it was a long time ago. The first helicopters flew in the 1930s, and the real helicopter became a vehicle and weapon only by the 1950s. What happened during these centuries? During these centuries, scientific technological progress was flowing. Someone invented technologies, someone invented structural materials, someone invented engines, someone invented energy carriers. Well, in general, several centuries after Leonardo da Vinci put forward this idea of a helicopter, all this in aggregate was embodied in a real flying machine. There is an interesting thing here. Many of those, maybe even the vast majority, who contributed to scientific technological progress in different centuries and made the possibility of the helicopter a reality, many of them did not even suspect who Leonardo da Vinci was. And they never thought about the idea of a helicopter. To put it differently, scientific technological progress is a kind of random process. But in order for the helicopter to fly, from the idea to the embodiment of the idea in metal and other structural materials, a number of stages were required. And if you set yourself the objective of analyzing how helicopters appeared in the history of mankind, then in general you can draw what is called a network diagram. The beginning, Leonardo da Vinci put forward the idea. The end, the companies of MIL, Kamov, Sikorsky and others that design and produce. And between the beginning and the end, there are many, many different particular stages. And if you throw out some stages, then there will be no helicopter, or there will be no helicopter with those flight performance characteristics that have been achieved by now. And what can be displayed as a network model can be called a scientific-implementational cycle. The scientific-implementational cycle is a social and economic process which is initiated by the advancement of a certain idea, the setting of tasks in the field of fundamental science, and which ends with the massive incarnation of products into life. And the creation of these products is impossible without some achievements of fundamental science, which took place in the past, sometimes in the very distant past. How here does the scientific implementational cycle flow? Firstly, to say that there is only one scientific implementational cycle is stupid, because scientific implementational cycles flow as a certain plurality in history. They flow internestedly with each other, because there are stages that are in demand by many sectors, for example, steel production, when it became not experimental, but mass production. Steel was in demand by many sectors, civil engineering, transport engineering, and other branches of technology. Take away steel, many areas of activity, in the form in which they are known to us, will become impossible. And the fact that a plurality of scientific implementational cycles flow simultaneously, and they are internested with each other, poses a question of culture, since it is culture that is the conductor of all processes that take place in the stream of scientific implementational cycles. Accordingly, culture can be absolutely or almost absolutely impenetrable for scientific implementational cycles, or it can be on the verge of superconductivity. Well, then see how it turns out. Here is a flowing scientific implementational cycle of a certain hypothesis, the setting of tasks in the field of fundamental science, and then something happens. The achievements of fundamental science are transformed into applied science, and in the end, we see mass-produced products based on confirmed hypotheses and solved tasks of fundamental science. And it can so happen that ideas are put forward in one culture and implemented in another culture. Further, in terms of modern economic theory, this is the question of the distribution of added value along the technological cycle, and the question of the distribution of investments along the same technological cycle. Here it turns out that everything related to fundamental science, R&D, research and development as the transition from fundamental science to applied science, is, first of all, investments, expenditures. But the mass production of something, based on the achievements of fundamental and applied science, is already a minimum investment, in comparison with the expenditures for fundamental science and research and development, and a maximum added value. That is, that which is happening is that which allows you to increase your purchasing power, if we do not touch upon the questions of pricing in the commonly used terms of modern economic theory. And therefore, when we talk about the fact that something was invented in Russia, that we are smart, then from the point of view of others we are idiots, because our ideas are being implemented in mass production somewhere outside of Russia. Well, remember there were several publications saying that our journal, Science and Life, was analyzed in Japan. All sorts of little things were patented there and integrated in mass production in Japan. And for those who were involved in this, they were a source of considerable income. And one can see that many things were invented in our country, but came to us in the form of finished products, ready-made technologies from abroad, for which we paid something. In other words, one of the problems of Russia is that our culture, including the culture of state governance, is such that scientific implementational cycles in it cannot be massively implemented. The only period when everything was different was the period of Stalinism Bolshevism, when the country lived in a catch-up mode of modernization and successfully developed science and technology. Yes, initially through the purchase of licenses, the purchase of technologies, but then our own established design and engineering scientific schools gave the beginning of new scientific implementational cycles. And if there hadn't been that dismantling of the Stalinist economy in the times of Khrushchev, and if there had been further development of all that good that was done in the times of Stalin, now the Soviet Union would be the only superpower, and there would be a queue for the right to join the USSR as allied republics, a queue of other states, which in their independent form are currently experiencing very difficult problems, including those of a non-scientific technical character, because Europe is dying, the US is dying, and the prognoses that the white race will have disappeared by the end of the 21st century are regularly announced, and demographic tendencies are what they are. That is, there are problems, and the problems are a consequence of the fact that the scientific methodological support of state governance is also far from being high. So there is nothing to adopt from there. Therefore, the modernization of the country and the making it a leader in scientific technological progress, the commitment to scientific technological progress of the quality which allows it to be safe, both for the biosphere of the planet and for the people themselves, this is the problematics that really needs to be dealt with. This is the question of how to modify culture so that it's a conductor close to superconductivity, figuratively speaking, for scientific implementational cycles. Therefore, it is necessary to see what factors affect the flow of scientific implementational cycles. First, someone has to generate ideas. Who has to? The wider the circle of people who are able to generate epochal ideas, the more chances there are that scientific implementational cycles will be carried out, that science will be a decisive factor in social development and economic development. And for this, in fact, it is required that culture does not suppress the creative potential of people, does not pervert it, but ensures the demand for the creative potential of the widest possible circle of people, and ensures the working out of such a personal culture of memory, senses, intellectual activity, that would allow a person to see problems, to dream, not to fantasize illusorily, in the style of Manilov from Dead Souls, but to dream. That is, life consistently think about improving the quality of life of society, seeing objective laws and patterns, objective possibilities to improve the quality of life of society. To put it differently, this leads directly to the fact that in the policy of the post-Soviet statehood in the field of education, there was subversion, because when the task was set to raise a qualified consumer who knows how to use the achievements of others, this task is dead-end. A qualified consumer can only come from a qualified creator. Because in order to use what others have developed, you need to understand how it works. And in order to understand how it works, you must think, and you must think creatively. And then there will be both a qualified creator and a qualified consumer. That is, in order for scientific technological progress to be, we need to evaluate as subversion all the reforms in the field of the system of education that were carried out after 1953, when the refusal of the separate education of boys and girls was made, and classes became common for everyone in common schools. Well, then there was a lot more, as a result of which the multiplication table is too difficult for many school graduates. The school's orientation towards educating a human creator is one of the factors of scientific technological progress. Well, then you see the situation is such that in fact you can use the scientific technological achievements of the past in order to develop them, or you can know nothing and go all the way to civilizational development from scratch. Naturally, this will take time, effort, resources. In other words, scientific technological progress is a question about free access to information, about scientific technological achievements that were made in the past, both in our country and abroad. And in the conditions that globalization is a hybrid war, it is a question of setting a regime of secrecy of work and a regime of openness of work. That is, this is a special and very complex theme, because if you classify some works, then on the one hand, yes, you provide a competitive advantage, on condition that potential enemies and competitors are not able to guess for themselves that this can be done. But along with this, you slow down scientific technological progress in your country, because these achievements may be necessary for the solution of some other problems in other spheres of activity, and if someone there who works in those spheres of activity does not have access to this information, then his activity turns out to be impossible, or he is forced to reproduce again what has already been produced by others outside the system of the secrecy regime. And then again the question arises of whether to classify or not. Then it turns out that if you classify something and it's inaccessible to you, and geopolitical enemies, economic competitors are able to guess beforehand, and they guess it but their system provides a higher performance speed in terms of realizing scientific implementational cycles, then despite your secrecy, they will find the result earlier than you. And in such situations it turns out that the system of secrecy of work is meaningless, because the system of secrecy of work should ensure a scientific implementational cycle, its implementation within the shortest reasonable time. If it becomes a hindrance to scientific implementational cycles, then you will inevitably lose, even though the enemy will not know what you are doing and how. He actually doesn't even need to know, if he has superiority in performance speed. And in his system, scientific implementational cycles are implemented faster than in yours. Moreover, they are implemented not in a single but in a plural quality. Therefore, the basis of the mass realization of scientific implementational cycles is free access to information for those who work out solutions to certain problems. At the same time, how to ensure the closure of information from unauthorized access to it by intelligence services of other states and corporations, because industrial espionage is also a type of espionage. And if within the state it is actually a blago, since on account of it, all companies participating in it develop, since they cannot but spend money on carrying out the relevant research and design, then in transnational, trans-state questions, industrial espionage is not the best phenomenon for ensuring the safety of one's own country. But this is a separate theme that needs to be dealt with, and which in fact no one in Russia deals with, because if you look at what is happening, the FSB are concerned about preventing and punishing for information leaks into foreign countries, but nobody deals with information that is introduced from foreign countries, which in a number of cases directs our science and technology to dead ends of development, and in fact to useless expenditures under the slogan, "There is no royal road to science." And not everything is predictable. No one is engaged in this, but this must be engaged in. But if there is a possibility of ensuring free access to those who work out problems of scientific technological information, then scientific technological progress can flow quickly. If there is a culture of dialogue between representatives of different narrow directions, then complex projects can be carried out, because whether we like it or not, nonetheless the quality of science, the pace of scientific technological progress, are now such that there is a certain division of specialists. Some know everything about nothing, while others do not know anything about everything. That is, the horizons are extremely wide, and superficial knowledge that does not allow entering the subject domain, or narrow professional knowledge that does not allow acting outside the narrow subject domain. And from the interdisciplinary chasms, in fact, very terrible monsters crawl out, monsters that are able to destroy civilization. This is what we must overcome. Then the question arises, Konstantin Edvardovich Tsiolkovsky could sit in his house on the second floor with an inkwell, paper and a pen and write epochal works. This is the minimum that he could do in his workshop. Well, now it turns out that everything that is epochal requires very serious investments, development, design, creation, including through new technologies, of an experimental base. In other words, apart from the information component, scientific technological progress also requires economic support. And with this economic support, the situation is such that fundamental science, research and development activities cannot be self-financing. These are, first of all, expenses. The question boils down to the fact that it is necessary to build such a financial climate in the state that would make it possible to finance knowingly unprofitable fundamental science and knowingly unprofitable, commercially non-compensating, financing research and development activities. The propaganda of liberal market nonsense, which cultivates the thesis that everything should be financially effective, and if it is not financially effective, then nobody needs it. This propaganda makes the fundamental science and R&D unnecessary, since they cannot be self-financing, and commercial production of products that meets the world level of development of science, technology, even more so, this very world level of development of science and technology, without fundamental science and R&D, is impossible. This is the main thing with regard to economic aspects, why Dmitry Anatolyevich, being president, and then being the head of government, turned out to be unable to carry out modernization. Because you cannot shove scientific implementational cycles in their mass scale, either into Skolkovo or into a limited set of federal universities and other kinds of academic towns such as the one in Novosibirsk. Scientific technological progress, this is massive. Next, look at what else this turns out to be. Scientific technological progress, when it flows in society, it actually flows in different ways. Something flows on the basis of a structureless method of governance, and in order to govern these processes, which flow structurelessly, you need to know what structureless governance is. You need to understand that the culture of a society is an informational algorithmic system in which structureless governance flows, and you need to impact the culture of society accordingly. And some issues can be governed structurally. An example of this kind: in the 1920s there was a civil war. TSAGI, the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, was created in the Soviet Union, which laid the foundation for the development of Soviet aviation. But it must be admitted that in Soviet times they hushed up the fact that the foundation of the TSAGI was created by the industrialist Ryabushinsky, who had emigrated to France after the revolution, and was not the last figure in the development of aviation and aerodynamic science there. Well, in general, the TSAGI is an example of how one of the directions of scientific implementational cycles was realized under structural governance. Nuclear projects in both the United States and the Soviet Union are also examples of structural governance. But all scientific technological progress cannot be governed in a structural way, also because scientific discoveries are unpredictable. And only after there is some groundwork can the state or any concern organize a structure that will absorb this groundwork, and further, thanks to the performance speed of the structural method of governance, bring this groundwork into mass-produced products. Therefore, it turns out that scientific technological progress largely flows structurelessly. And this also means that physical and legal entities should have possibilities of economic support for the development of fundamental science and research and development work. Accordingly, this is again a question about the financial climate. This is a question about the chart of accounts as a tool for governing economic life, including the economic support of scientific technological progress. And again, in our country, no one at all, in state power and in scientific officialdom, is engaged in this. And since nobody is engaged in this, the scientific technological backwardness of Russia is programmed, as well as the catching up character, the development of its economy. It is when we are doomed to buy licenses, and the developers who own these licenses will decide what to sell us and what not to sell. And accordingly, in such conditions, the entirety of the sovereignty of the state, a guaranteed bright future, turns out to be impossible. And one more question is related to the fact that those who can potentially be those who work out solutions to various problems in the course of scientific technological progress, they should want to do this. And to want is not the economy as such, it is not access to information, it is not a culture of personal psychic activity, which sometimes allows one to solve the most complex tasks in passing. To want to conduct this very scientific technological progress is a consequence of the conviction that social organization is previous. Well, the State Duma, the government, conduct a survey in Russia on the theme, who considers the social organization that emerged after 1991 and was legalized in the 1993 Constitution to be previous. If we turn to the historical past, then the scientific technological miracle that the USSR delivered is largely the result of the fact that the people who even worked in very small organizations, read the book The Fleet That Destroyed Khrushchev, they considered the ideals previous and could endure the mistakes and abuses that arose during the implementation of these ideals. The Third Reich delivered scientific technological miracles, and the scientific technological archives of the Reich were raked up until the mid-1950s, and they became irrelevant only from the second half, due to the fact that Hitler and Goebbels were able to convince the Germans that the Third Reich was realizing certain ideals of previousness. Once again, I draw your attention to the fact that I don't advertise the Third Reich as an ideal. I am saying that our fathers and grandfathers, in the period from 1941 to 1945, broke the very effective military economic and scientific technological machine of our enemy. It was a very effective machine, and the happiness of many people is conditioned by the fact that the world behind the scenes was able to provoke Hitler to war in 1939, but not 10 to 15 years later, when the Reich could have reached the level of qualitative superiority in science and technology over the liberal bourgeois Europe and America. In this case, history would have been much harder and more hopeless. Therefore, I will return to where I started. The fact that the verse was thrown out of the text of Sacred War is not for nothing, because the ideals of previousness, they can be deceptive, or they can be objectively alternativeless. And in order for everything to be good, it is necessary to build a culture so that objective, alternativeless ideals of previousness are expressed in it. It is necessary to build a culture so that it is a conductor of scientific technological progress in its safe form for the biosphere and society as a whole. That is, it is necessary to build a culture so that the creative potential of everyone is perceived as an all people, all human property, so that the creative potential of everyone is realized meaningfully, by volitional order, under the power of the dictatorship of Soviet. Then there will be not a modernization of the country, but a transformation of the country, as a generator of the transformation of the entire global civilization.